Okay, so the first posture that we want to look at from the natural set is Buddha's Judgment, or the Buddha's Judgment forearm strike, and it's called that, so I've been told, because if you get hit with this right in the neck at full power, you will wake up in the afterlife and the next thing you will be facing is Buddha's Judgment. And for that reason, I would very rarely do things like that in sparring. I don't want to be hitting someone in the neck or even in the face with the bone in my forearm. But I will use versions of it when I'm doing more close range stuff, if we're doing kind of get into a bit of a stand-up grapple, or I use it sometimes in push hands. But I still practice it in various other ways, most importantly on the heavy bag. And also remember, there are always two versions of everything at least. So one where we strike and there's a little bit of a gap, so we use what we call gap Farley, and a version where our hand or our body part, our limb, is on the other person and bracing and taking their weight, and then we have to do Farley from within our own body, so we have to create the space within the articulation of our own body. But for this set of postures, we're just looking at the strike version, so we're hitting in and there's a gap between the hitting point and the target. So let's look at the brass tacks of the posture first. We're swinging the arm in, and the version we're doing first is lateral, so the arm is broadly speaking flat with the ground, although we're using pivot root, so that lifts us up a little bit. And we're hitting in with the bone of the forearm. Or rather, that's the ideal hit point, so not the inside of the hammer fist, the inside of the forearm, hitting with that solid bone there. Although anywhere all the way along, back down to the elbow, crook of the elbow, you can catch with that, or even the bicep or back to the shoulder, although the bicep can be quite sensitive, obviously, if it smashes into something solid. But so can any part of the arm, but the bicep particularly. It's not necessary to do the gurning face, that's just something I tend to do when I'm moving slowly. But it is necessary to keep all the joints of the body bent, and this is what we mean by bow, or it's the external appearance of what we mean by bow. There's a feeling inside of how all the joints are knitted together, but externally it looks like all the joints are bent, and they should be bent and curved. If the arm is straight, then you're going to injure it when you hit a solid object. And this is important not just for issuing force, i.e. generating kinetic force, but also for hitting at the strike point. So let's just have a little bit of a quote from Yao Zongzun as remembered by or recorded by his student Bo Jiakong. And Yao Zongzun said regarding storing force, "This refers to storing energy in preparation for issuing it. The basic practice of standing postures requires focusing the spirit, not letting the mind wander and gathering the force inward. The whole body should have no flat surfaces, and all large and small joints must remain slightly bent, storing force internally. During movements, pay special attention to the aforementioned points, checking for any blank or deficient areas. Only when intent carefully attends to all areas can the body's force become unified with the chi and strength fully integrated, achieving a rounded, balanced state. This is known as moving and stillness centered, both guarded and usable." Note also there that Yao Zongzun is using the concept of chi, by the way, and more importantly in this case, anyway, the idea of roundedness and storing force also being there in use, and implied within that as well is the contact point when you hit, and Yao Zongzun talks elsewhere about doing that and using it in push hands and so on. And this is particularly important in any posture that uses muscle alignment, and particularly if it places an enormous amount of stress on a big muscle like the pectoral muscle, which this posture does. So when you swing in and hit, there's a massive amount of stress on that area, and it's really easy to tear it. You've got to be really careful about it. You've got to build strength. You've got to learn how to relax so that your structure isn't brittle, which can refer to the muscular structure as much as the bone structure. And you have to just build up step by step, so hitting a bag light and then building up. Even just doing it on the air, you can tear a muscle, so you have to be really careful with these postures, particularly if you do the hit and stop at the centre line. That's the tear point. Next, let's think about the position of the legs specifically, and remember that we're still exploring the logical model. And one of the things that we've said as part of that exploration is that having one leg forward isn't just about it being more defensive. Yes, it hides your centre a little bit, which Yao Zhongzun says is one of the key things that we need to think about. But always when you hide one thing, you reveal something else. So you make your lead leg easier to hit, for example. So the idea that being side on is just better for combat, and that's why it's the combat stance, that's really a very basic understanding in each one. It's elementary level. The real issue is around Farley and vulnerability. To use Farley, you need to relax for a split second to be able to generate the velocity that's going to go into the equation, velocity times mass. And in that moment, you become vulnerable. And this, by the way, that I'm telling you now is completely orthodox Yiquan theory. Well, as long as you assume that Yao Zhongzun is orthodox Yiquan. Bo Jiakong tells us about this. In fact, he gives us some writing that Yao Zhongzun did around this concept of vulnerability through Farley. And to understand that, you have to understand Farley in the way that Yao Zhongzun and Wang Xiangjai understand Farley, i.e. it's a short, sharp movement. So you have to get the hit point, in this case the forearm, to the target, and then use a short, sharp movement to release force. But what happens if the hit point is quite far away from the target? You've got to move it towards the target. And that movement is much bigger than Farley itself, because Farley is a short, sharp movement. And when you see the old Yiquan masters demonstrating like this with the big wavy arms and the big steps, what you don't usually recognise is that they are hiding a lot of pre-movement within that stepping. And you can get a bit of a wind up on it, bit of a swing, a bit of centrifugal force, but the main thing in reality is that you need to get the hit point closer to the target. So waving your arms about, yes, it gets more volume into the posture, but it also gets the striking point nearer to the target. So you wave your arms and they move towards the target, and then you do that very short, sharp movement, that Farley. And this is very much misunderstood, as people think that waving your arms about like that is either some kind of defensive thing. So Kenichi Sawai, one of Wang Xiangjai's students, talks about the arms being like insect antennae, but they don't really need to wave about like that to be that. Other people think it's about making your movement very unpredictable. Actually, it makes you highly predictable, because people tend to have, particularly Yiquan people, if you watch them carefully, they have very simple, predictable patterns in the way that they move their arms about like that. It's part of a kind of pretense of formlessness that some people in Yiquan have, or quite a lot of people I have to say in Yiquan, pretend to be formless whilst having very predictable movement that all looks identical to everyone else in their school. It's really the opposite of formlessness. And that's the problem. The idea is that the short, sharp movement is more efficient for generating and transmitting force, but the big movement doesn't really mask it or hide it, certainly not to anyone who's competent, unless you're incredibly lucky. And that's why you see, particularly with Yao Zhongzun students, a radical divergence at this point, because they recognise that that's not efficient enough for dealing with modern martial artists, particularly looking at Western boxers and Thai boxing, which Yao Zhongzun was also very interested in. They know it's not good enough for dealing with that. And that's part of the problem with all this stuff about challenge fights and so on in China. Well, people are in their cave of time, so moving into the future, the new challenges meant that, well, you couldn't beat the modern fighters in the way that people in the past had been beaten, because the level's gone up. So you have to think about and solve this problem. And the solution is take that extra movement that people began putting in their arms and their big steps and start putting it back in the body. And we'll come back to that in a moment, but the other thing that we need to think about right now is something that we looked at in the previous videos, which is that when you have an unbalanced posture, that it's a lot easier to generate force from that position than it is from a balanced posture. So the saying is that the unbalanced posture, or the single weighted posture, does half the job for you. So that's about offense, not defense. It's about being in a better physical stance for generating force. Okay, so to solidify our understanding of this and to move on with our learning about the Buddha's judgment forearm strike, let's look at a closely related posture, the hook punch. And the first thing to notice about this is that the hook punch hits at a higher point than the forearm strike. So the hook punch is hitting at the head and the forearm strike is hitting somewhere at the chest level. And the simple reason for this is that the forearm strike is just a basic expression of the laws of physics combined with human physiology. So other than a few basic quintessence principles of wushu like Farley and hit and stop, there's no thought been given to where we're hitting other than we just want to hit out and strike with the forearm. Whereas with the hook punch, a decision has been made by people in the past that punching someone in the side of the head really hard with your fist is an excellent move within the reality and context of an actual fight. So the posture has been deliberately designed, or in each one we say it's been stacked to facilitate that outcome, that deliberately specified outcome. And for that reason, thinking in binary terms for the moment, the hook isn't part of the natural set. The hook is part of a cultural set. I mean, remember, it's a continuum and there's no clear division, but the natural set is towards one end of the continuum and cultural sets are towards the other end of the continuum. And not all martial arts are based on the same quintessence principles. They're all based on the same laws of physics, but not all martial arts have hit and stop. For example, some Western boxers use hit and stop, but most don't. But Western boxing absolutely is a cultural set. And in Chinese martial arts, any form of wushu is an expression of its own natural set. So what changes amongst the five elements is the fifth element, the use of body mechanics. So not every Chinese martial arts has whole body unified force, but combined together the five elements with whatever version of the fifth element they're using, everything is an expression of a natural set. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily effective, just that it follows naturally from a set of assumptions about movement that are made within that style. And that doesn't mean that the people who developed those branches of wushu trained the natural set. The natural set is just the logical expression of the core principles that all forms of wushu are based on. And it's just in the genius of Wang Xiangjia that while lots of martial arts around the same time, lots of martial artists around the same time as Wang Xiangjia were talking about natural movement, it's only Wang Xiangjia who breaks free from forms. It's only Wang Xiangjia who recognises that all forms are cultural sets, and to actually find that natural movement you have to go back to the natural set. However, Wang Xiangjia himself recognised that as they were being exposed to people with higher level, that each one itself had to evolve and improve. And he says something about when you meet a naughty monkey, you've got to raise your game to, i.e. naughty monkey, someone who's got a much higher technical level. You also need a higher technical level, and that applies to each one itself. And what I want to demonstrate is how cultivation happens within an individual's understanding of a movement, but also how it happened over time within each one itself. And to understand that, let's first go back to the forearm strike itself and have a look at how it uses the four contexts, or which context does it use. Well, you can see quite clearly that it just uses open. The qua is opening, the hips are moving away from one another, so it's open. But you can also see very clearly in this movement that there's opening in the chest as well. So the whole structure, the whole torso is open. And the reason that it's open isn't based on a decision, it's just based on the natural physiology of the body. The context that has the most structural sympathy with this posture is open. And anyone who experimented with it for a while, trying to find the best way, would soon understand that that's the case. It just is the natural context that goes with this posture. But now let's contrast that with the hook. And hooks, by definition, as cultural set postures, are more complex. And that, pretty much as a rule of thumb, always means that there's multiple different possible ways of doing the posture, and very often multiple different possible ways of using the 4 primary contexts. In any case, a hook is a much more tightly knit posture with the forearm in line with the hip point and a sharp, solid hip point in terms of the fist, and that makes it much easier to transmit force, but also because the posture is smaller, it makes it harder to generate force. The forearm strike, by contrast, is much more open, so it's got much greater volume, but it's also a much bigger posture, a much more elongated posture, and there's nothing in line with the hip point, there's nothing behind it. So there are multiple points along the joints because of the stress on the joints where the force that you generate, even though it's bigger than the force you can generate with a hook, because the movement's got more volume and you can get a little bit more swing on the arm and there's more leverage, nevertheless that force is dissipated much more easily. And again, anyone can easily test that for themselves just by pushing against an object, a wall or a tree, with the hook posture or then with the open arm forearm strike posture. You can feel the way that the energy is dissipated and gone. It's not so easy to feel the generation of force because that's a matter of cultivation, but let's discuss that a little bit. So the question we want answered first of all is, if a hook posture is smaller, how do you compensate for that? How do you add in more power? And this is going to explain a lot of things about how we might structure the forearm strike. So let's think about the kind of hook that might be used in Western boxing. And there's a few things to notice here as we talk about this. So the first thing is that in this version, I'm not just using open. It finishes with open, but it begins with close. So look closely and you'll see the right hip is moving forwards, and then that's phasing into or spiraling into or figurating into open. So right hip forward, then left hip forward, and that slingshots the punch out. And that's just our very basic, what Wushu would be a quintessence principle of adding more volume into a posture to try and create more power, or using phased movement to create more volume to add into what is actually quite a short range movement. So with the hook, everything's about how do you get more power into it. But of course, that's always contextualized by the reality of the context of the fight. So you get more power into it by keeping the movement shorter. It's what in each one we would call a very short or very tight muscle alignment. So the muscles are curved round. We're not relying on the alignment of bones. We're relying on the curvature of the muscles, but being locked into a really tight structure. And that's going to transmit the force through the density of the muscles and the posture that we're creating. And critical to that endeavour is that we are minimizing the amount of looseness of joints or pressure on joints or flexibility of joints where force can be lost. So the more you extend your arm out, the more pressure is on the shoulder, the more movement there is in the shoulder, the elbow, and so on. If we minimize that, then we can transmit more of that force into the punch. It won't be dissipated. And of course, this posture is much tighter, so it's much better defensively. So it's overdetermined why you would want to do it like this. The problem, of course, is that even though slingshotting the punch in with this combination of close and then open creates more power, it's also a tell. It reveals what you're going to do, and it's really easy to spot, and it slows down the overall posture. In which case, you want to take that out and you want to compensate with something else, i.e. getting stronger physically or improving technique, and then just sacrificing that extra little bit of power you would have got from slingshotting it. Meanwhile, in another time and place, early Yiquan is evolving. It's very close to the natural set, so it's relying very much on centrifugal force, big swinging movements, lots of muscle alignment postures as opposed to bone alignment postures. And they are very interested in maximizing power. And one of the things that they do is disguise this movement where they use close first, close and then open in a step. So they've learned this from Xing Yiquan, that you can use compensatory force, that you can use steps to add power into it. So if you look at this posture, it's using close and then it's using open, but it's disguising it in a step. And then for the rear hand hook, close and then close, but the principle is the same. You're using the steps to allow you to exploit the contexts to make the punch actually massive. It's a two-step movement to try and get as much power into it as possible. And sure, you can move like that. You can do that in sparring. You can have a bit of a play with it, moving like the old Yiquan masters. And, you can make it work to a degree, but it relies a lot on there being a big skill difference, which, let's be honest, that's why the old Yiquan masters were successful with it. But Yao Zongzun and then his students, and particularly his sons, the famous Yao brothers, they recognised pretty quickly that for modern Yiquan, you got to have a much tighter structure. You've got to follow the general principle of Yiquan, of cultivating so that postures become smaller. So you need a tighter, more compact structure, and you also need to develop really seriously good reactions to make all of this work. So to cut a long story short, in terms of the hook, the Yao brothers particularly want to modify it in line with Western boxing, but not completely the same as Western boxing, because they don't want that centrifugal hooking out of the arm that gives the hook posture its name. That would contradict the quintessence principle of Wushu that says that, well, particularly from Xing Yiquan, that the forearm should be like a spike that's hit out with a mallet. And if you don't follow those quintessence principles of Wushu, then what's the point? So it's not really Chinese martial arts anymore, it's something else. And Wang Xiangjia has said you've got to follow those quintessence principles of Wushu. Not that it's doing it for doing its sake, there's reasons behind it about force transmission, economy of movement and so on. But that's what they set to, working out how to change that posture, make it more compact, but still in line with the quintessence principles of Wushu. So I assiduously endeavour to avoid using other people's copyrighted material, but I'll use a couple of screenshots of videos, and I'll put the links to the videos in the description, that show how Yao Chengguang and Yao Chengrong come to different conclusions, different solutions to this problem. And I'm afraid they're not really great photographs. I couldn't get a really clear photograph that demonstrated this. You kind of have to watch the video. But Yao Chengrong's solution is to add a lean over. So when he throws the hook, he leans his whole body over in line with the hook, quite dramatically actually, and the more so if he's hitting a pad or something like that. And what you've got to understand about that is that when you see, for example, a Western boxer putting that swing into the hook, that movement, that's volume. And when you take that volume away and change it into a kind of spiky hit, that you've got to put that movement back somewhere if you want to keep that power. So that movement from the swinging hook, Yao Chengrong puts it back in with a lean over to the side. And this is an important part of what we mean by cultivation, always looking how to shift movement back into the body, because the body can absorb a massive amount of movement and disguise it as a much smaller movement, so always looking for ways to do that. The problem, however, is if you throw a hook like that and you lean over, it's a little bit like both Yao Chengguang and Yao Chengrong do a lot of postures where they lean their posture all the way back, which is obviously a dangerous thing to do. It only takes a little bit of a push to push you off balance. Similarly, if you throw a big hook and you dramatically lean over with it in the way that Yao Chengrong does, even if someone just completely by coincidence hits you on the shoulder in the same direction at exactly the same time as you do that, then you're going to go flying whether you're a Yao brother or not. And ironically, the more powerful you are, the more power you put into that hook, the more you're going to send yourself flying, because they're just going to push that extra little bit that pushes you off balance, and your own force is going to send you off balance. So scientifically, it's not the best solution. In this case anyway, I generally speaking think Yao Chengrong is higher level than Yao Chengguang. He's just a much more natural martial artist in my view. And if you look, for example, at his kicks, they are clearly, scientifically, significantly higher level than Yao Chengguang's kicks. That's just an empirical fact. But in this case, his solution isn't the right solution, and Yao Chengguang's solution is. And the key here is that Yao Chengrong's solution only uses open with a skewed axis. So he uses Farley using his whole body shifting to the side. By contrast, Yao Chen Guang's solution is to keep the axis straight and turn the whole body rotationally using rotational Farley round the vertical axis, but to combine open with rise. And he uses approximately 75% open, 25% rise. And that creates quite a lot more volume, and it keeps the posture tighter, and it's also less dangerous. Now, 75% open, 25% rise, that's not the most powerful way of doing it. If you can just nudge that up to 30% rise, 70% open, you can experience it yourself. You can empirically demonstrate that that's more powerful. But power isn't the only consideration, so I do it about 70-30, but that reveals much more of your body, whereas if you just tweak it down a little bit, 75-25, that's a tighter, slightly tighter structure, so it hides more of your centre, which is a key idea that Yao Zhongzun talks about. So it just depends how you're thinking about it, how Yao Chen Guang is thinking about it. But that's the solution, combining those two contexts into one to create more volume and more power. And our question then is how you take all of these ideas that we've looked at in terms of the hook and then apply them to the Buddha's Judgment forearm chop, because actually there's quite a lot of different ways of doing that. And which ones are we going to choose to maximize power or maximize defensive capability? How are we going to arrange that? Or, as we say in Yiquan, stack that posture? And I'll just finish this video by saying, you know, I've said before, there's all these people who say, don't think about it, just pay me and I'll think for you. Well, actually, this isn't a very complicated way of thinking about each one. It's an incredibly simple but nevertheless dynamic tool that we can use not just to analyse other people's movements, but to problem solve ourselves and think about what happens if we change the ratios of these, what are after all just 5 elements, and from those 5 elements there's an infinite possibility of analysis and problem solving. So it's actually an incredibly simple concept. It's not some massive theoretical structure or anything like that, but it is incredibly useful. So next we better start looking at the details of the lead forearm chop and see how we apply these.